In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, an elderly woman suffering from dementia vanished from her nursing home one stormy night in 2019. Staff believed she must have slipped outside, wandering into the dark streets, lost and confused. But investigators found no footprints, no witnesses, and no trace of her anywhere on the facility's security cameras. For 2 long years, her family agonized without answers, until maintenance workers repairing an old service elevator stumbled upon something horrifying wedged deep inside the shaft. A discovery that would shatter every theory and raise far darker questions. The storm came in heavy that night, sheets of rain hammering the roof of Rosewood Care Facility as if trying to pry their way inside. The wind howled against the windows, bending the branches of the oak trees that lined the parking lot. The storm drowned out everything else. Footsteps in the hallways, the shuffle of wheelchairs, even the faint cries that sometimes carried from the rooms at night. It was the kind of weather that turned even the familiar into something threatening. And it was on that night, in 2019, that 79-year-old Margaret Hale simply vanished. Margaret was frail, her body whittled down by years of dementia that left her mind slipping in and out of recognition. Some nights she knew her daughter's name, other nights she didn't know her own. She was quiet, prone to staring out the window at nothing, her lips moving as though she were speaking to someone no one else could see. The nurses had grown used to it. To them, she was just another patient on the long list of nightly bed checks, another fragile life to keep safe behind the locked doors. At 9:45 p.m., Nurse Ellen made her final rounds of the West Wing before the storm reached its peak. She pushed open Margaret's door and found her as usual. Small frame curled beneath the thin blanket, eyes closed, breathing shallow but steady. Ellen noted it in her log, pulled the door shut, and moved on. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. By the time Ellen circled back at 11:30, the storm was at its worst. The lights flickered, and for a moment the hallway went dark. When they blinked back to life, Ellen opened Margaret's door again, expecting to see the same fragile figure in bed. But the bed was empty. The blanket was folded down, as if carefully moved aside. Margaret's slippers were missing. The bathroom light was off, the door half open, and no one inside. Ellen's stomach dropped. She whispered aloud without thinking, as though Margaret might answer.
"Mrs. Hale?"
She hurried down the hall, checking the activity room, the lounge, the laundry. Nothing. Her shoes squeaked against the tile as she rushed back to the nurse's station. "She's gone," Ellen said, breathless. "What do you mean gone?" the head nurse asked, her face blanching. "I just checked on her. She was there earlier. Now she's not." Within minutes, the staff spread out across the building. They searched the hallways, stairwells, the small chapel where residents sometimes went to sit alone. They opened closets, checked bathrooms, even the kitchen curtain. Every locked door remained locked. Every alarm system showed green. The storm outside raged on, the pounding rain masking their voices as they called her name again and again. "Margaret? Margaret Hale?" But the only reply was thunder. At midnight, the search took on a sharper edge. Staff who had once whispered reassurances to each other now looked at the locked doors with unease. The facility had been designed to prevent exactly this. Patients with memory loss could not wander freely. Exits required code. Windows were locked from the inside. The security cameras, though old, covered the main hallways. And yet Margaret was gone. Ellen stood in the West Wing hallway, staring at the empty bed as the storm's wind rattled the window panes. Her mind replayed the last time she saw Margaret, eyes closed, lips moving faintly in what looked like prayer. Ellen remembered thinking she looked almost peaceful. Now that image was shattered. Another nurse burst in. Not in the courtyard, not in the laundry. Nothing. The head nurse's voice trembled as she made the call to the local police. "We've lost a resident." By 12:30 a.m., flashlights swept the grounds outside. Officers trudged through the mud in heavy raincoats, their beams catching on dripping hedges and rain-slicked pavement. No footprints led away from the building. No doors had been forced open. The cameras showed nothing but flickering static during the storm's worst minutes. Inside, the staff gathered, soaked and shaken, whispering questions none of them wanted to say too loud. She couldn't have gone outside. The alarms would have triggered. No, the doors were locked. She couldn't have known the codes. Ellen leaned against the wall, her chest tight. She kept hearing herself say the words over and over. She was just here. I saw her. She was. By dawn, the storm had passed. The rain left the earth heavy and swollen, puddles reflecting the gray morning sky. Officers scoured every corner of the property, every storage shed, every tree line, every drainage ditch. Dogs were brought in, sniffing the grounds. They picked up Margaret's scent near her room in the hallway, but nowhere else. It was as though she had ceased to exist the moment she stepped away from her bed. At 8 a.m. the staff gathered once more in the common room, exhausted and shaken. The head nurse tried to maintain authority, but her hand shook as she spoke. She couldn't have simply walked through locked doors, she said. Her voice was low, firm, but edged with disbelief. Ellen looked at her colleagues, each pale and wide-eyed. The storm had passed, but the terror it brought lingered in the sterile air. And in that moment, one question gnawed at them all. If Margaret didn't leave the building, then where did she go? Before she was a missing person, before her name filled police reports and news articles, Margaret Hale was simply a daughter, a sister, a mother. She had grown up in a small Ohio town where the summers were thick with the smell of cut hay and the winters carved frost across the windows like lace. She was the middle child of 5, the quiet one, often found sketching flowers in the margins of her school books or humming while she helped her mother hang laundry in the yard. She always had this gentleness about her, her older brother once recalled, voice trembling years later. The kind that made you feel safe, even if she wasn't saying a word. That gentleness carried into adulthood. Margaret married young, to a man named Robert, a machinist with strong hands and an easy laugh. Together they had one daughter, Claire. Their life was modest but happy. Picnics in the park, Sunday dinners heavy with roast chicken, evenings spent with Margaret reading aloud from library books while Claire curled against her side. For decades the Hale household was steady, predictable, quietly warm. But time, as it does, reshaped everything. Robert died suddenly of a heart attack in the late 1990s, leaving Margaret adrift in grief. Claire, then in her 20s, moved back home for a time, trying to anchor her mother in the storm. They leaned on each other, mother and daughter, both hollowed by loss. Still, Margaret carried on. She joined a church quilting circle, planted roses along the walkway, filled her house with the quiet rhythm of survival. But by her early 70s, something began to slip. It started subtly, misplaced keys, forgotten appointments, names momentarily lost on the tip of her tongue. Claire dismissed it at first, just aging, she told herself. But the slips became falls. She left a stove burner on. She wandered outside in the night, confused about the date. One morning, Claire found her mother standing barefoot in the yard, staring at the rising sun with a look of panic. Margaret turned, eyes glassy. I don't know where Robert is. He was supposed to pick me up for school. The diagnosis came swiftly, dementia creeping steadily toward Alzheimer's. Claire sat in the sterile doctor's office, gripping the paper handout with clinical terms that felt colder than anything she'd ever read. Her mother's mind, once sharp and tender, was unraveling. There was no cure, only care, management, and the cruel progression of forgetting. For a while, Claire tried to keep her at home. She rearranged her work schedule, installed locks, sticky noted reminders on the fridge. But Margaret grew restless, unpredictable. She grew agitated when Claire corrected her, sometimes lashing out with words that cut deep. Then moments later forgetting she'd spoken them at all. The house filled with tension, love and grief pressed together in unbearable weight. I don't want to put her in a home, Claire confided to a friend one night over the phone. Her voice cracked under the guilt. But I'm losing her, and I'm losing myself. By 2018, the decision was made. Rosewood Care Facility had experience with memory patients. They promised safety, locked exits, 24-hour staff, personalized care. Claire walked beside her mother on that first day, carrying a small suitcase filled with familiar objects. A quilt Margaret had sewn, framed photos of Robert and Claire as a child, a ceramic vase of silk roses. "I'll be back tomorrow," Claire told her as she set the suitcase on the dresser. Margaret blinked, a faint smile flickering. "Did Robert say he'd come too?" Claire swallowed hard. "He'll be here in spirit." The weeks passed, and Claire visited often, her heart torn each time she walked through those sterile halls, smelling faintly of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. Sometimes her mother recognized her, face brightening like a child's. "She's fading," Claire admitted to one of the nurses. The nurse placed a hand on her shoulder, "but she still feels your presence, even when she doesn't remember the details." That comfort was thin, but it was all Claire had. She clung to it, convincing herself that the facility was the safest place for her mother. That at least here, she could rest, knowing Margaret couldn't wander into traffic or slip into the night unnoticed. And so Claire trusted the locks, the cameras, the alarms. She believed the assurances, repeated like mantras. "She's safe here. Which made what happened on that storm-racked night even harder to accept. When Claire received the call, her mother missing, her first words were disbelief. "That's impossible. I was just there today. She was fine. She was—" Her voice fractured on the last word, the memory sharp and cruel. She had held her mother's hand only hours earlier, had kissed her forehead and whispered goodbye. Nothing seemed amiss. There had been no sign of agitation, no talk of leaving. Just a quiet visit, one of dozens. And now, in less than a night, Margaret was gone. The disbelief hardened into rage. How could she just vanish? Claire demanded when she arrived at the facility, soaked by the rain, her hair plastered to her face. "These doors are locked. The windows are locked. You told me she couldn't get out." The nurses stood pale and silent. Police officers whispered to each other in clipped tones. The storm outside had passed, but inside the air was heavier than ever. Claire's voice dropped to a whisper, more plea than accusation. She couldn't have just walked away. "Where is she?" No one answered. And the cruelest part was this. Claire swore she had seen her mother that very day, smiling faintly, holding her hand. Hours later, Margaret had simply vanished. The rain had finally stopped by the time detectives arrived at Rosewood Care Facility, but the storm's aftermath lingered in the air. Puddles glistened under the security lights, reflecting the stark white of the building's walls. Inside, the fluorescent bulbs buzzed faintly, giving the corridors a sterile glow that seemed at odds with the panic settling over everyone within. Margaret Hale had been gone for less than 12 hours, and already the fragile confidence in Rosewood's safety measures was unraveling. Detective Samuel Briggs, a man whose calm voice rarely matched the intensity in his eyes, was the first to sit down with the staff. He began not with accusations, but with quiet questions that carried the weight of disbelief. "These doors are locked at all times?" he asked, his notepad open, pen poised. The head nurse nodded, though her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. "Yes, exits require a code. If opened without entering it, alarms go off immediately." "And last night? Did any alarms trigger?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. Briggs scribbled the answer down. "So, your theory is what? She simply vanished through solid walls?" The silence that followed stretched painfully. A nurse shifted in her chair, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "She couldn't have gotten out, not without help." The words hung there like a noose. Briggs moved next to the security office, where grainy monitors displayed camera footage from the night before. The storm had disrupted the feed at intervals, leaving blank streaks of static, but even when the screens flickered back to life, there was no sign of Margaret. No small figure shuffling down a hallway, no movement toward the exit doors. It was as if she had never left her bed. "Run it again," Briggs instructed. The officer replayed the hours from 9:30 p.m. to midnight. The footage showed staff moving through corridors, a nurse pushing a supply cart, a flicker of lights during the storm's worst surge. But nothing of Margaret. "She doesn't appear on any camera," the officer said finally, "at all." Briggs leaned forward, jaw tight. "So we have a missing woman in a locked building, with locked doors, no triggered alarms, and no visual record of her moving anywhere." He tapped his pen against the desk. "Explain that to me." One young orderly cleared his throat. There's one possibility. Sometimes during smoke breaks, staff prop the side door open. Just a few minutes. Maybe she slipped out then. The room bristled with unease. Briggs zeroed in. When was the last smoke break last night? Around 11, the orderly admitted. It was raining so hard we stayed under the awning. Cracked open, but only for a few minutes. Briggs's eyes narrowed, and in those few minutes, in a torrential storm, a 79-year-old woman with dementia slipped outside unnoticed, past staff standing right there. The orderly swallowed. I didn't see her. Of course you didn't, Briggs said softly, though the edge in his voice cut like glass. Outside, officers examined the grounds again, focusing on the side entrance. The earth was waterlogged, the grass beaten flat by rain. If Margaret had stepped out into the storm, she would have left some trace, slipper prints in the mud, a drag of cloth, something, but the ground showed nothing. Clean, undisturbed. Ellen, the nurse who had checked Margaret's bed, followed the detective outside. Her hair clung damply to her face, her hands twisting together. She couldn't have gone out there. Not in that storm. She could barely walk on her own some days. Briggs studied her carefully. Then where did she go, Nurse Ellen? Her voice cracked. I don't know, I swear I don't know. By late afternoon, the contradictions stacked higher than answers. The facility boasted doors locked from the inside, alarms wired to prevent patient escape, and a security system meant to watch every hallway. Yet none of those systems explained Margaret's disappearance. She was not on camera. No alarm had sounded. No footprints showed she had braved the storm. The investigation twisted tighter when staff files were reviewed. Briggs discovered small inconsistencies, missed logs, a door code recorded as changed weeks earlier but never updated in the system. Nothing criminal but enough to suggest negligence. Sloppy work hides mistakes, Briggs muttered under his breath as he flipped through the reports. Or worse, the red herring of the smoke break refused to die easily. Some staff clung to it, desperate for a simple explanation. She must have slipped past us, the orderly repeated, as though saying it enough times would make it true. But Briggs stood firm. You want me to believe a fragile woman, in slippers, in torrential rain, walked past 3 employees, unseen, leaving no trace behind? That's not a theory. That's wishful thinking. The contradiction gnawed at everyone involved. Families began to call, worried whispers spreading among residents. If Margaret could vanish, who else might? What good were codes and locks if people simply disappeared into thin air? By nightfall, Briggs stood again in Margaret's empty room. The blanket lay folded, undisturbed since Ellen's discovery. The slippers remained missing. A faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. He placed his hand against the locked window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. If she didn't leave, he said quietly, then she's still here. The words chilled Ellen, who stood in the doorway. She thought of the corridors searched, the rooms opened, the closets checked. The building had been combed over and over, and still, no trace of Margaret. The storm had taken away footprints, blurred cameras drowned out sounds, but storms do not erase people. And yet on that night, in that locked building, Margaret Hale was gone. The next morning, weather reports confirmed what the officers already knew. The rain had been relentless, heavy enough to wash away shallow tracks. But still, slippers would have left something. And in the official reports, a line was added almost reluctantly, a contradiction that could not be shaken. She may have slipped out during a smoke break, yes, but weather reports showed torrential rain that night, yet no muddy footprints were ever found. The dawn that followed Margaret Hale's disappearance was heavy and gray, the sky still bruised from the night's storm. Mist clung to the grass along the roadside, and the smell of wet earth filled the air as patrol cars lined up outside Rosewood Care Facility. Their red and blue lights pulsed against the pale morning, casting restless shadows across the building's white siding. Detectives had little time to waste. By sunrise, officers and volunteers fanned out across the neighborhood. They trudged through waterlogged yards, their boots sinking into soft soil, the slap of rubber soles echoing off empty streets. Flashlights combed through brush and drainage ditches, beams slicing through the fog like knives. From the tree line came the steady bark of orders, clipped and urged. Check the creek bed, one officer shouted. Fan out, Every yard, every garage, leave nothing untouched. By mid-morning, the dogs arrived. Trained German shepherds and bloodhounds strained against their leashes, noses pressed low to the damp earth. Handlers guided them to Margaret's room, where they lifted the blanket she had left behind. The dogs buried their snouts in the worn fabric, inhaling the scent of old skin and lavender lotion. Then they were off, claws clicking against the tile, leading their handlers through the West Wing corridor and out toward the parking lot. For a moment, hope surged, but it evaporated just as quickly. At the edge of the lot, where rain pooled in cracked asphalt, the trail went cold. The dogs circled, whined, and pulled in confused spirals, noses darting but finding nothing. "She didn't go farther than this," one handler said grimly, patting the dog's flank. Detective Briggs scowled at the empty road beyond. "So she makes it to the parking lot and disappears into thin air." "That's not possible." Inside the facility, Margaret's daughter, Claire, had joined the volunteers. Her face was pale from exhaustion, her hair damp with mist. She handed out stacks of flyers, Margaret's photo staring back from the grainy paper, eyes crinkled with a gentle smile, hair pinned back neatly, a woman who looked far from the shadow she had become. "Please," Claire said, her voice breaking as she passed the sheets to strangers. "Please look, anywhere she could be. She's sick. She won't know how to get home." Back in the facility, the detectives regrouped. Briggs stood at the nurse's station, staring at the floor plans spread across the desk. His partner, Detective Ramos, leaned over his shoulder. "She wandered off," Ramos said. "It's the simplest explanation. Storm knocked out the cameras. Staff left a door open. She slipped out, confused. Happens all the time with dementia patients." Briggs shook his head. "Simplest, maybe. But not the most convincing. You saw the ground outside. Rain like that doesn't erase everything, and the dogs picked up nothing past the lot. Where'd she go, Ramos?" "She sprouted wings. Maybe she collapsed somewhere we haven't searched," Ramos countered. "The storm covered her scent, washed the trail." Briggs closed his notebook with a snap. "Or maybe she never left the building." The words drew a sharp look from his partner. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that if she didn't walk out, then someone helped her out, or kept her in." The tension between them thickened like smoke. Neither wanted to voice what they both considered, but could not prove that Margaret's disappearance wasn't just the cruel twist of dementia. Something else had happened here. Something deliberate. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the residents. Elderly voices carried fragments of rumor through the sterile hallways. One woman told her daughter she hadn't slept that night because of the storm. She claimed she heard footsteps hurried and heavy, passing her door when no nurse was scheduled on rounds. Another swore she heard a door slam, though no alarm had sounded. And then came the most disturbing account, muttered in a trembling voice by a man confined to a wheelchair near the end of the hall. "I heard her," he said, eyes wide, hands shaking as he clutched his blanket. "I heard her screaming." His daughter tried to hush him, but the words spilled out like poison. "It was late, past midnight. The rain was loud, but I know what I heard." She was calling for help. From inside the building, the rumor spread like wildfire, carried on hushed tones from one resident's family to the next. Nurses dismissed it, claiming the man was often confused, prone to hallucinations. But detectives didn't ignore it. Briggs wrote it down, underlining it twice in his notes. Outside, the search continued long into the evening. Floodlights bathed the grounds in harsh white glow. Volunteers trudged with weary steps, their clothes damp, their voices hoarse. Still, nothing. No footprints, no scraps of fabric, no body. Inside, the unease deepened. Families lingered in the hallways, their eyes darting to the staff with suspicion. The image of Margaret, frail and vanishing, clung to everyone who passed her empty room. And when the detectives finally left for the night, the question remained suspended in the air like the last rumble of thunder. Had Margaret wandered off into the storm, unseen, or had something far more sinister happened within the very walls of Rosewood? Because if the residents' trembling claim was true, then Margaret hadn't vanished outside at all. Every disappearance leaves behind someone who refuses to move on. For Margaret Hale, that person was her daughter, Claire. In the weeks after her mother vanished, when others began to accept the impossible silence, Claire could not. Her nights became a blur of headlights and dark roads, her hands locked around the steering wheel as she circled the same neighborhoods again and again. She drove past gas stations lit by humming neon, through cul-de-sacs still slick from spring rains, and down service roads where weeds clawed at the edges of broken asphalt. Each time she slowed, rolling down the window to call into the night. "Mom, Mom, it's me, Claire." Her voice carried into the emptiness, swallowed by the hum of insects and the distant hiss of cars on the highway. She knew it was futile, knew Margaret in her fragile state could never answer. But still, she drove. Inside her car, the passenger seat overflowed with flyers, stacks of her mother's photographs smudged at the edges from rain and handling. She carried them everywhere, into diners, churches, corner stores. Sometimes she would stop at a Walmart parking lot, handing them to strangers as they pushed carts to their cars. At home, the toll of her obsession seeped into every corner of her life. The breathword. Meals went untouched. Work calls went unanswered. Friends who tried to comfort her found themselves pushed away. One evening, an old college friend left a voicemail, her voice tight with concern. "Claire, you can't do this forever. You're burning yourself alive. You need to rest." Claire never returned the call. Instead, she turned to the only place she felt heard, social media. She uploaded her mother's photo alongside desperate pleas for information. She joined missing persons groups, posting updates, clinging to the digital reach of strangers. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, some cruel, others claiming to have seen women matching Margaret's description wandering in distant towns. Each tip sent Claire spiraling. She would drive hours in the middle of the night, chasing rumors. In one small town, she scanned the aisles of a convenience store after a clerk swore an elderly woman had come in barefoot, muttering to herself. The woman was gone by the time Claire arrived. Another time, a trucker claimed to have seen someone near a rest stop. Claire combed the area until sunrise. Nothing. Her brother, Mark, tried to intervene. He called her one evening, his voice hoarse with frustration. "No," Claire snapped, gripping the phone with white knuckles, "they're not doing enough. They stopped searching days ago. If I don't look, no one will." There was a silence, long and aching. Finally, Mark said quietly, "You're not the only one who lost her." The line went dead before Claire could reply. The strain began to fracture her relationships. Friends drifted, her brother stopped calling. Even her own daughter grew distant, unsettled by the haunted look in her mother's eyes. But Claire pressed on, driven by a force she couldn't explain. At night, she dreamed of her mother's face, pale and frightened, calling her name. She woke drenched in sweat, the echoes still ringing in her ears. Sometimes she replayed their last conversation over and over, the memory etched in cruel clarity. That day at Rosewood, hours before the disappearance, she had kissed her mother's forehead. "Goodbye, Mom. I'll be back tomorrow." Her mother's faint reply, so ordinary at the time, was now unbearable. "All right, sweetheart, don't be long." The words gnawed at her. She hadn't known they would be the last. Friends recalled their final phone calls with Claire during that period, describing her voice as sharp, restless, always circling back to the same obsession. She wouldn't talk about anything else, one said. Work, family, nothing mattered. It was always her mom, always the mystery of how someone could just disappear. As the weeks stretched into months, the flyers yellowed on telephone poles, edges curling under summer heat. News stations moved on, covering fresher tragedies. But Claire kept searching. She drove the same roads, knocked on the same doors, clung to the same hope that somewhere, somehow, her mother was waiting. The detectives, too, couldn't escape the weight of the case. For every report they closed, for every lead they dismissed, the same truth returned like a shadow they couldn't shake. Detective Briggs, flipping through his notebook late one evening, muttered to his partner, "She couldn't have simply disappeared without help." His words echoed what Claire already knew deep in her bones. Theories are the lifeblood of any disappearance, but in Margaret Hale's case, they piled up like smoke, shifting, obscuring, suffocating, yet never solid enough to hold. By the 6th week, investigators had exhausted the simple explanation of the locked doors, the storm, the possibility of a wandering patient. They no longer fit cleanly together. And so the case began to spiral into shadows where every face in Rosewood carried suspicion and every unanswered question pointed toward something darker. Detective Briggs kept a corkboard in his office, photographs and timelines pinned in messy constellations. At its center sat Margaret's portrait, eyes kind, smile soft, an image at odds with the sharp red string that radiated outward into possibilities. "Am I?" Briggs shot back. He pointed to the notes. No footprints, no scent trail, no alarm triggered. And the cameras? Static, during the exact window she disappears. That's not wandering, Ramos. That's precision. The contradiction hung between them, unsaid but undeniable. At Rosewood, staff found themselves under an invisible spotlight. Detectives interviewed them one by one in cramped offices, the hum of fluorescent lights amplifying every nervous twitch. Some swore they'd checked every door, every corridor. Others grew defensive, tired of the insinuation. "Do you really think we'd hurt her?" one nurse snapped, her voice breaking. "We're here to protect these people, not bury them." But background checks revealed uncomfortable truths. One orderly had a record of minor thefts. Another nurse had been disciplined years earlier for negligence in another facility. None of it amounted to proof, but together it painted a picture far from the pristine reputation Rosewood wanted to project. And then came the blind spot. While re-examining the security footage, a technician noticed something troubling, a section of hallway near the service wing that wasn't covered by any camera. It was an oversight, buried in the building's design, but it left a pocket of darkness, one that connected to maintenance rooms, and a disused stairwell. Briggs leaned closer to the screen as the technician outlined the blind zone. "So, let me get this straight. If someone wanted to move her unseen, all they had to do was bring her here." The technician nodded reluctantly. "Convenient," Briggs muttered. "Too convenient." This revelation breathed new life into darker theories. Had Margaret been led or carried into that blind spot? Had she fallen in the stairwell? Or worse, had someone used that hidden corner to make her vanish permanently? The staff pushed back hard. The administrator insisted no one could have slipped through unnoticed. "We conduct hourly checks," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "If she was there, we'd have found her." But Briggs wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, the community began to weave its own narrative. At diners and church gatherings, whispers turned into rumors. Some believed Margaret had been abducted by a staff member, hidden away until the storm masked the evidence. Others thought she had taken her own life, slipping into some unseen corner of the building to escape her confusion. The more dramatic rumors painted Rosewood itself as haunted, an old structure swallowing its residents whole. For Claire, the theories were a cruel carousel she couldn't escape. Each time a new one surfaced, she latched on with desperate hope, only to be broken when it collapsed under scrutiny. "She didn't kill herself," Claire said firmly during one interview. Her voice trembled, but her conviction did not. "My mom was scared, yes, confused. But she wanted to live. She asked me about tomorrow. You don't talk about tomorrow if you're planning to die tonight." Yet abduction seemed impossible too. The doors were locked, the staff vigilant. No one had been seen entering or leaving the building with anything unusual. No cars came or went during the critical window. It was as if the very air had swallowed Margaret. Theories swirled, each more desperate than the last. "What if she climbed into the ducts?" one officer suggested half-heartedly, staring up at the ceiling grates. "She could barely walk," Briggs shot back. "You think she shimmied through air vents?" "What if someone smuggled her out in laundry carts?" another offered. Briggs didn't dismiss it outright. "Check them. Every cart, every delivery log." Hours of investigation led only to dead ends. No missing linens, no tampered ducts, no sign of forced entry or exit. Still, the blind spot nagged at Briggs like a splinter. He found himself standing there late one night, flashlight sweeping over the walls. The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and mildew. The maintenance door creaked on its hinges, unused but not locked. He placed his hand on the cold railing and muttered to himself, if she was here, why didn't anyone hear her? The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the building itself was keeping its secrets. Red herrings continued to tangle the case. A man reported seeing a frail woman matching Margaret's description at a bus stop miles away. Another swore he'd seen her wandering near a strip mall. Both leads fizzled. Mistaken identity, nothing more. Each false lead pulled Claire deeper into despair. She clung to Briggs during one meeting, her voice breaking. "Tell me she's not just gone. Tell me someone knows what happened to her." Briggs met her eyes, his own dark with exhaustion. "Someone knows," he said quietly. "The question is who." By autumn, the case files bulged with contradictions. A woman vanishing from a locked facility, cameras blind in the exact place she might have been moved. Staff under suspicion but never charged, families angry, residents whispering, detectives circling theories that collapsed under their own weight. Someone or something had helped her vanish. The seasons changed, but the silence around Margaret Hale's disappearance did not. Spring melted into summer, leaves burned red and gold, snow returned, and still there was no trace. What had begun as a frantic investigation, with search teams combing the neighborhood and detectives filling their notebooks, slowly dimmed into something quieter, something heavier. A cold case, filed in drawers but never forgotten. For Claire, the silence was the loudest sound in her life. Each morning she woke with a jolt, half expecting the phone to ring with news. Each night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the same moments in her head. Her last visit, her last words, her last smile. At first, her home filled with visitors, friends bringing casseroles, neighbors dropping by with sympathetic faces and empty words. But as weeks stretched into months, the visits slowed. People moved on. Their lives continued. Claire's did not. She drove the same loops she had traced in the early weeks, but now with hollow eyes, hands trembling from fatigue. Flyers once bright with ink, now hung yellowed and curling on telephone poles. When she taped fresh ones, they sagged against rusted nails. The town no longer looked at the flyers, they had faded into background noise. Detectives Briggs and Ramos still carried the case file, but their energy dimmed too. Leads had dried up, interviews yielded nothing. Theories once argued with fire were now muttered like half-remembered prayers. "She's gone," Ramos said one evening in the station, closing the file with a dull thud. "We'll never know what happened." Briggs bristled. "No. People don't just vanish. Somebody knows." But even his voice carried less conviction than before. The silence was winning. At Rosewood, the disappearance lingered like a stain the staff couldn't scrub away. Families whispered in the hallways, eyeing the nurses with suspicion. New residents hesitated at the doors, reassured by management but never fully convinced. Some avoided the West Wing entirely, as if Margaret's absence lingered in the walls. Rumors still floated, low, unsettling, impossible to kill. A few residents swore they heard cries at night. Others said they had seen shadows in places no one should have been. The staff dismissed them as paranoia, symptoms of failing minds, but for those who believed, Rosewood was no longer safe. Claire tried to keep the pressure alive. On anniversaries, she spoke to local reporters, her voice cracking as she held her mother's photo up to the cameras. But each year, fewer reporters came. The story was no longer fresh, no longer sensational. It was just another unsolved disappearance, one of many. The silence stretched into a second year. For the detectives, Margaret became a ghost in their files. A face that appeared during late-night shifts when paperwork stacked high and memories clawed unbidden. Briggs in particular felt the case gnaw at him. He would drive past Rosewood sometimes without reason, staring at the glowing windows, wondering which one had framed Margaret's last look at the world. Claire's life had narrowed to obsession. Relationships fractured. Her daughter grew distant, frightened by her mother's relentless fixation. Friends stopped answering calls. She became the woman who haunted community meetings, who cornered police officers with new questions, who refused to let silence close the door. And yet, despite her tenacity, nothing came. No body, no clue, no whisper of truth. It was as though Margaret had never existed at all. Until the summer of that July, maintenance crews were dispatched to Rosewood to repair a service elevator that had been malfunctioning. The shaft had not been inspected in years, its dark recesses avoided except by workers when absolutely necessary. Tools clanged, dust stirred, the smell of oil and rust rising in the confined space. As the crew lowered themselves deeper into the shaft, flashlights cut through the gloom, beams catching on metal rails and dangling cables. One worker paused, frowning. His light had landed on something that didn't belong, something pale and fabric-like, wedged awkwardly in a corner far below. "Hey," he called, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "What the hell is that?" The others leaned over, beams converging. For a long moment, no one spoke. The shape came into focus, the sagging remains of clothing, discolored and clinging to what looked unmistakably like bone. The shaft filled with silence, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, one of the workers whispered, "Oh my God!" 2 years of silence shattered in an instant. The service elevator shaft at Rosewood was a place most people never saw, a forgotten vein of the building, hidden behind heavy metal doors, its air stale with years of dust and oil. Few entered it unless absolutely necessary, and so, when a maintenance crew descended in July of 2021 to repair the malfunctioning lift, they expected nothing more than rusted gears and corroded cables. What they found instead was the end of a mystery that had haunted the facility for 2 years. The crew worked in silence at first, their tools clanging faintly, flashlights sweeping over steel rails that stretched into shadow. The shaft swallowed their voices, returning only hollow echoes. The smell of old grease and damp concrete lingered, heavy enough to sting the throat. "Check the lower track," one worker called, lowering himself further down. His boot scraped against metal, sending sparks into the darkness. He swung his flashlight across the shaft wall and froze. Something pale glimmered faintly under the beam. Not metal, not concrete, something softer, sagging, wedged awkwardly against the framework. "Hey," he said, his voice echoing nervously. "What's that?" The others leaned over the railing above, beams converging. The pale shape resolved into fabric, threadbare, stained, clinging to a form hunched unnaturally. Beneath it, unmistakable even in shadow, was... The worker recoiled, breath catching in his chest. Jesus Christ! The shaft filled with a terrible silence, the kind that presses into the ears until the heartbeat becomes deafening. Slowly, carefully, the crew climbed back up, their hands shaking as they called their supervisor. Within the hour, police officers were standing at the lip of the shaft, staring down into the dark. Detective Briggs was among them. When the call came through, he hadn't hesitated. He drove faster than he should have, lights flashing, the case file burning in his mind. For 2 years, he had lived with unanswered questions, but now finally the shaft whispered answers. The body was removed with painstaking care. Technicians descended, gloved hands guiding brittle bones and deteriorated fabric into evidence bags. The stench of decay rose sharply once the remains were disturbed, a smell that clung to their clothes and seemed to seep into their skin. One officer gagged behind his mask. Another muttered a prayer. When the remains reached the light, there was no doubt. The clothing matched Margaret Hale's last known outfit. A faded cardigan. Slippers worn thin. The coroner's team confirmed it quickly. After 2 years of silence, Margaret had been found, but her discovery did not bring relief. It brought more questions, questions darker than before. The position of the body was wrong. She was not sprawled as though she had fallen. She was wedged, almost folded, in a space so narrow it seemed impossible she had ended there on her own. Her cardigan was tangled around her arm, her head rested against the cold steel as though she had been placed rather than dropped. Detective Ramos stood with his arms crossed, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. So she wandered into a service elevator, slipped through a maintenance door, and fell 2 stories. His tone carried doubt he didn't bother to hide. Briggs shook his head slowly. If she fell, why isn't she lying at the bottom? Why is she stuck halfway down? A technician spoke carefully. The shaft door on this level was sealed from the outside. No resident should have had access. Not without a key. The words landed like stones in a pond, ripples spreading through the silence. Claire arrived not long after, her body shaking as officers led her into the facility. She pressed her hands to her mouth when she saw the coroner's van waiting outside, the stretcher covered in a black shroud. "Is it her?" she whispered to Briggs, her voice breaking. Briggs looked at her, unable to soften the truth. "It's her." That night, the shaft was cordoned off with yellow tape. Officers moved through the service wing with flashlights, documenting every bolt, every latch, every sign of tampering. But there was nothing. The door was intact, the lock unbroken, the alarms never triggered. "It doesn't make sense," Ramos muttered, running a hand over his face. "How the hell did she even get in there?" Briggs stared at the sealed hatch, its metal surface gleaming under flashlight beams. His voice was low, grim. "She didn't get in there by herself." The chilling weight of those words settled over the team. Margaret Hale had been found, but not in a way that brought closure. Instead, the discovery of her body in the shaft cracked the case open wider than ever. If she hadn't wandered off into the storm, if she hadn't left the building at all, then someone, somehow, had made sure she was hidden in a place no one would think to look. For 2 years, she had been there, feet from where her daughter once stood, searching, calling her name. All the while, the truth sat sealed behind a maintenance door, cloaked in shadows and silence. And now that truth was out in the open, demanding answers. But the shaft had given only one. Margaret Hale hadn't vanished into the night. She had been here all along. The discovery of Margaret Hale's body did not end the mystery, it deepened it. When the coroner's van pulled away from Rosewood that night, the silence it left behind felt heavier than before, as though the building itself exhaled something it had hidden for 2 long years. But the real work was only beginning. Forensic science, not rumor, would now decide how Margaret had died. The examination room was sterile and cold, a place where grief was stripped away and replaced with evidence. Under harsh white lights, Margaret's remains were laid out with delicate care, bones brittle with time, clothing stiff with decay, and fragments of hair clinging stubbornly to the skull. For all the searching, the nights of fear and speculation, this was what was left of her, a body speaking only in fractures and shadows. Dr. Elaine Morris, the county medical examiner, adjusted her gloves and leaned over the table. She had seen hundreds of cases in her career, but this one carried the weight of a story that had gripped the community for years. She studied each bone, each tear and fabric, as detectives Briggs and Ramos watched from the observation window. "The first thing we need to establish," Dr. Morris said, her voice clinical, "is whether this was accidental or intentional. Did she fall, or was she placed?" The silence in the room sharpened. She began with the fractures. The ribs were broken, several cracked clean through. The right hip showed signs of a violent impact. But the skull? Only minor trauma. Not what you would expect from a fall 2 stories down a shaft. "If she had dropped from the top," Dr. Morris explained, pointing to the x-rays, "we'd expect massive cranial damage. Neck fractures, spinal injuries. Instead, the breaks are more consistent with compression. Pressure. Like she was wedged, trapped, not free-falling." Briggs's jaw tightened. "So she didn't fall." Dr. Morris hesitated. "Not in the way you'd think." "She wasn't outside that night," Dr. Morris concluded. "At least not long enough to soil these. She was indoors when this happened." Claire, when told, nearly collapsed under the weight of it. "I knew it," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "She never left the building. She was here the whole time." But the question remained, how had she gotten into the shaft at all? Forensic teams examined the maintenance door that led into the service area. It was still intact, its lock undisturbed. Official records showed it had remained sealed for months after Margaret's disappearance, and yet her body had been found inside, impossibly wedged between the rails. "The only way this works," Briggs muttered, staring at the diagrams, "is if someone opened that door with a key and then shut it again." The implication was brutal. For 2 years, every staff member had sworn they had no idea what happened. Now, evidence suggested otherwise. "Did you have access to the maintenance keys?" Briggs asked one orderly. "No," he said quickly, sweat beading on his brow. "Only supervisors did." To the administrator, Ramos posed the same question. "The keys were locked in the office," she insisted. We monitor their use. They weren't touched. Then how do you explain the body in the shaft? Briggs pressed, his voice low and sharp. She stammered, unable to form an answer. The forensic report only sharpened the contradictions. Time of death was estimated within hours of her disappearance, meaning Margaret had likely died that very night, which meant for 2 years her body had been sealed behind a door no one admitted to opening. Rumors reignited, fiercer than ever. Some claimed a staff member had panicked after an accident and hid her body. Others whispered of deliberate neglect. Someone covering their tracks, and there were those who believed something even more sinister, that Rosewood had secrets darker than anyone dared speak. The forensic team found no clear cause of death. Decomposition had stripped away the finer evidence. No knife wounds, no gunshot, no obvious trauma. The fractures could have come from being pressed into the shaft. The rest was silent. But silence can be damning. Briggs stood over the final report, his reflection staring back from the glass. This doesn't tell us who, but it tells us this. She didn't just wander in here on her own. Somebody made this happen. He remembered the resident's trembling claim 2 years earlier, the words dismissed as confusion. I heard her screaming from inside the building. And now, with her body found wedged in a shaft she could never have entered alone, Briggs wondered if that resident's memory had been the closest thing to truth all along. The file was stamped with words that offered no comfort, cause of death undetermined. But Briggs knew better, determined or not, this was no accident.
Margaret Hale had not vanished into the storm.
She had been hidden, silenced, and left in the shadows of Rosewood, where no one was supposed to look. The revelation that Margaret Hale had been inside Rosewood all along struck like a thunderclap. For 2 years, administrators had reassured families that their loved ones were safe behind locked doors, watched by cameras, guarded by alarms. Now those same families stared at the news reports in horror, realizing that a woman could vanish not into the night, but into the very walls of the place that promised protection. By the following week, Rosewood Care Facility was no longer just a nursing home. It was a crime scene. News vans crowded the parking lot, cameras angled toward the pale building as reporters delivered breathless updates. Headlines screamed across local papers, elderly woman found dead in facility's elevator shaft. The story spread beyond Ohio, picked up by national outlets hungry for scandal. Rosewood's pristine reputation collapsed overnight, leaving administrators scrambling for words they didn't have. We followed all proper protocols, the facility's director said at a press conference, his tie crooked, his face pale under the glare of cameras. This was an unforeseeable tragedy. Our hearts are with the Hale family. The crowd erupted in shouted questions. Then how did she get in the shaft? Why didn't anyone check sooner? What about the residents who claimed they heard screams? The director faltered, his rehearsed phrases unraveling. The press smelled blood. Families smelled betrayal. Inside the facility, nurses and orderlies moved under the weight of suspicion. Some resigned, unwilling to face the glare of public outrage. Others stayed, insisting they had done nothing wrong. But whispers grew among staff about a missing key, about an unlogged door check, about secrets that had been quietly buried until Margaret's discovery dragged them into the light. Claire, now at the center of the storm, refused to let Rosewood deflect blame. Standing outside the facility, clutching a framed photo of her mother, she spoke to reporters with a voice that trembled but never broke. They told me she was safe here. They told me she couldn't get out. And all this time she was right here, trapped, dying in the dark while we searched outside. My mother deserved dignity. Instead, she was left to rot in a shaft. And no one has given me an answer for how. Her words echoed across living rooms and headlines, igniting outrage far beyond her small town. Advocacy groups seized the story, demanding reforms, investigations, accountability. Rosewood became a symbol of negligence in elder care, a warning of what happens when profit eclipses compassion. But the anger was not only public, it was personal. Other families with loved ones inside Rosewood began recalling lapses of their own. Alarms that didn't sound, doors left ajar, residents found wandering into restricted areas. Each story added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a facility where safety was promised but rarely delivered. One daughter, whose father lived in the East Wing, told detectives she had reported a faulty lock months earlier. They never fixed it, she said bitterly. They said it wasn't a priority. Another woman remembered her mother complaining about staff leaving doors propped open during smoke breaks. At the time, she'd brushed it off. Now, it felt sinister. Lawsuits followed quickly, thick envelopes of legal demands piling on the director's desk. Families sued for negligence, for emotional trauma, for the breach of trust that Margaret's death had exposed. Rosewood's legal team scrambled to contain the damage, but the tide was unstoppable. The police investigation intensified. Detectives Briggs and Ramos, once dismissed by administrators as overzealous, now had the weight of the state behind them. Every record was scrutinized. Every staff member re-interviewed. How many people had access to the maintenance keys? Briggs demanded in one interrogation. Only a handful, the administrator replied, sweat glistening at his temple. And yet somehow, the shaft door was opened. You expect me to believe it opened itself? The man had no answer. Still, despite the mounting evidence of negligence, there was no proof of murder. No fingerprints, no signs of a struggle, no smoking gun. The case hovered in a gray space caught between tragedy and crime, between accident and cover-up. For Claire, this limbo was unbearable. She visited the facility's hallways less often, unable to stomach the sight of the place that had stolen her mother's final moments. Yet when she did return, she would stop near the West Wing, staring at the elevator shaft doors with hollow eyes. She was in there, she whispered once to Briggs, her voice trembling. For 2 years, and we walked past her, every day. We prayed, we begged for answers, and she was right there behind that door. Briggs could not bring himself to reply. He felt it too, the weight of having missed something so close, so obvious, yet so hidden. The lawsuits dragged on. The public outrage simmered, and Rosewood's future hung by a thread. But the questions remained. Even negligence couldn't explain why the alarms never sounded. Even human error couldn't fully explain how Margaret ended up sealed in that shaft. It was the kind of contradiction that refused to rest, gnawing at detectives, haunting families, and leaving a shadow that no press conference or settlement could erase. Because in the end, Rosewood was not only under fire, it was under suspicion. Grief has many faces, but for Claire Hale, it became a mirror she could not look away from. The discovery of her mother's body inside Rosewood had given her what she thought she wanted: answers. Yet the reality was far crueler. Margaret hadn't wandered into the night, lost and confused. She hadn't slipped away quietly. She had been trapped, entombed in steel and darkness, only feet from where her daughter had stood searching, calling her name. It was not closure. It was torment. Claire walked the halls of Rosewood in the days after the discovery, her steps heavy, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. Reporters swarmed outside, lawyers circled with promises of justice, but inside the building she was alone. She paused at her mother's old room, the bed neatly made, the dresser empty now, except for a faint scent of lavender lotion clinging to the wood. She pressed her palm against the wall and whispered, "I was right here, Mom. I was so close." Memories surged without mercy. She remembered the last time she had kissed Margaret's forehead, just hours before the disappearance. She remembered leaving through the very hallway that now felt like a mausoleum. And most of all, she remembered the years of searching, driving through darkened streets, plastering flyers across town, begging for answers while her mother had been so close, hidden behind a sealed door. The guilt was unbearable. At home, Claire's nights became fractured dreams. She would wake in a cold sweat, convinced she heard her mother's voice calling faintly, echoing as though from deep underground. Other times, she dreamed of the shaft itself, the smell of rust, the suffocating dark, her mother's frail body folded in the void. She would jolt awake gasping, her chest tight, hands clutching the sheets as though clawing her way out of the nightmare. Friends urged her to step back. Her brother, Mark, visited one evening, his face lined with worry. "You can't keep going like this," he told her, voice quiet. "It's eating you alive." Claire shook her head, her hands trembling around a mug of untouched tea. "She was in there for 2 years, Mark. 2 years. While I was out searching the streets, handing out flyers, chasing ghosts. She was right there, and I didn't know.
You couldn't have known, he tried to soothe.
But Claire's voice cracked. I should have. I felt it. I knew she didn't leave that building, and still, I let them convince me otherwise. Mark had no reply. He simply placed a hand over hers, the silence between them thick with unspoken pain. Detective Briggs met with Claire soon after, not as an investigator, but as a man carrying his own burden. He found her sitting outside the courthouse after yet another legal meeting with Rosewood's attorneys. She looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders bowed under invisible weight. They failed her, Claire said bitterly before Briggs could speak, and I failed her too. Briggs sat beside her, his notebook unopened for once. His voice was low, steady. Don't put that on yourself. This wasn't your fault. Claire's eyes burned as she turned to him. Then whose fault is it? Because somebody opened that door. Somebody sealed it again, and she died because of it. Briggs didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, the investigation had stalled. Negligence was easy to prove. Intentional harm was not. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no confession, only a body in a place it never should have been. But Briggs felt her pain as his own. He remembered the hours poring over maps, the endless interviews, the hollow frustration of dead ends, and then the bitter truth that all along, Margaret had been just beyond their reach. I walk these halls, Claire whispered, her voice breaking, and I imagine her calling for me. I imagine her pounding on that door, waiting for someone to come. And no one did. Her words twisted in Briggs's chest. He thought of the resident's long-dismissed claim. I heard her screaming. What if it had been true? What if Margaret had begged for help in the darkness, unheard or ignored until the storm outside drowned her forever? Claire's reckoning was not only with the facility, but with herself. She replayed every decision, every moment she had chosen to believe in Rosewood's promises. Had she been too trusting, too willing to hand her mother's safety to strangers? At night, she stood in front of her mirror, whispering questions she could never answer. Were you scared? Did you know I was looking for you? Did you think I abandoned you? Her reflection stared back, empty. The lawsuits pressed on, and Rosewood's administrators continued to deny responsibility. But for Claire, the legal battle was only noise. Her true reckoning was with the ghost of her mother, an absence that filled every silence, every shadowed corner of her life. One evening, she returned to the facility alone. The hallways were quieter now. Many residents moved to other homes, the building half abandoned. She stopped before the sealed elevator shaft, its metal doors gleaming under the dim lights. She placed her hand against the cold surface, her forehead leaning forward until it rested on the steel. Tears slid down her cheeks. You were here the whole time, she whispered, and I never found you. The words broke her, spilling out in sobs that echoed faintly through the empty hall. For a long time she stood there, the building silent around her, as if waiting for a reply. But none came, only the hum of the lights overhead and the weight of a truth she could never escape. Her mother had been just feet away. And no one, not the staff, not the detectives, not even Claire herself, had reached her in time. The discovery of Margaret Hale's body should have brought resolution. Instead, it fractured the case into more questions than before, each theory darker, each shadow longer. Investigators, family, and community members clung to explanations, like lifelines, only to find themselves circling back into the same abyss. None of them made sense. Detective Briggs spread the case files across his desk late one night, the glow of his lamp casting sharp edges across photographs and reports. Margaret's smiling portrait stared back from the center of the table, surrounded by grainy stills of the security cameras, copies of maintenance logs, and sketches of the elevator shaft. 2 years of investigation, and still the puzzle resisted every attempt to be solved. She couldn't have gotten in there herself, Briggs muttered, his finger tapping against the shaft diagram. Not without help. His partner Ramos leaned back in his chair, rubbing tired eyes. Help or negligence? Maybe a door was left open. Maybe someone forgot to lock it. She wanders in, falls, gets stuck. No conspiracy, just tragedy. Briggs shot him a look. And the sealed door? The alarms that never went off? You call that tragedy? I call it tampering. The argument had become routine, circling endlessly. Ramos leaned toward the simplest answer. Briggs was drawn to the sinister. Neither could prove the other wrong. Theories multiplied like cracks in glass. Some believed Margaret's death had been an accident, plain and brutal. A staff member might have left the maintenance door open while moving supplies, unaware Margaret had wandered inside. When they realized what happened, panic overtook them. Instead of raising the alarm, they sealed the door, terrified of losing their job or facing charges. Others whispered about deliberate intent, that someone inside Rosewood wanted Margaret gone, perhaps a staff member overwhelmed, perhaps someone with darker motives. To them, the shaft was not a tragic accident, but a hiding place. Still others clung to stranger ideas, that Margaret had been moved into the shaft days or weeks after her disappearance, hidden deliberately once the search grew desperate. If she had fallen, why wasn't her body at the bottom? If she had been hidden, how did no one notice the tampered door? If it was deliberate, where was the proof? Claire wrestled with these questions relentlessly. She filled notebooks with her own timelines, sketches, theories scrawled in desperate handwriting. Late at night she sat at her kitchen table, pages spread before her, whispering to herself as though her mother might answer. She couldn't open that door, Claire muttered. She didn't know the codes. She couldn't climb stairs without help. Someone did this. Someone had to. Her friends tried to intervene, begging her to rest, to let go, but Claire couldn't. She played and replayed the scenarios in her mind until they blurred together, haunting her every thought. Detectives returned again and again to the blind spot in the security cameras, the stretch of hallway near the service wing that remained uncovered. It was the perfect place for something to happen unseen, yet no staff member admitted to being there. No logs recorded activity. The silence of the cameras was a void investigators could never fill. One evening, Briggs and Ramos interviewed a former custodian who had left Rosewood months earlier. He sat nervously in the station, his hands twisting in his lap. The custodian hesitated. Once or twice. Doors were supposed to be locked, but sometimes they weren't. Residents wandered. We'd find them confused, bring them. Did you report it? He looked away. Not always. Management didn't like problems. They wanted quiet, clean logs. The admission deepened the shadow of negligence. If doors had been left unsecured before, why not the night Margaret vanished? Still, Briggs couldn't shake the darker possibility. One staff member had been disciplined years earlier for leaving patients unattended. Another had a history of violence outside work, though never charged. Individually, the details seemed minor. Together, they painted a picture of a facility where oversight was more illusion than reality. Someone knew, Briggs said one night as he and Ramos left the station. Maybe not everyone, but someone knew she was in there. Ramos sighed. Or maybe we're looking for malice in a place already drowning in incompetence. Sometimes negligence kills, Sam. It doesn't need to be murder. But Briggs's silence told its own story. For Claire, each theory carried its own torment. If it was an accident, it meant her mother had suffered alone, calling out in vain. If it was deliberate, it meant she had been betrayed by those trusted to care for her. And if it was negligence, a door left open, an alarm ignored, then it meant her mother's death was preventable, the result of careless hands. During one interview, a reporter asked Claire which theory she believed. Her reply was quiet but fierce. I don't care which one is true, none of them bring her back, but I'll never accept that she just wandered off. Somebody failed her. Somebody let this happen. The theories became ghosts, each haunting in its own way. They filled courtrooms, family meetings, detective reports, late-night whispers in residents' rooms, but none gave the comfort of certainty. And through it all, one detail remained like a thorn no one could pull. The shaft door had been sealed from the outside. Briggs stared at the maintenance records once more, his pen hovering over the page. That door didn't seal itself, he murmured. The implication hung in the air, heavier than any theory. Accident, negligence, cover-up, murder. None could be proven. But one fact gnawed at detectives, at families, at everyone who followed the case. Who sealed the hatch after Margaret disappeared? Even after the lawsuits, the press conferences, and the endless theories, the air around Rosewood never cleared. The building itself seemed to carry the weight of the unanswered questions, its white walls no longer symbols of safety, but of betrayal. Families walking through its halls whispered more than they spoke, voices dropping whenever they passed the service wing. The silence of Rosewood had taken on a life of its own. For those who lived there, Margaret Hale became less a person than a presence. Residents spoke of her in hushed tones, as if invoking her name might stir the shadows. Some swore that at night, when the halls were quiet and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, they heard her voice, faint cries, a woman calling for help, echoing as though from behind the walls. Nurses dismissed these stories as imagination, symptoms of failing minds, but the whispers never stopped. One resident, an elderly man in a wheelchair, insisted to his daughter during a visit, "She's still here. I hear her. She calls in the dark." His daughter pressed her lips together, unsure whether to comfort him or believe him. The community outside Rosewood was no less haunted. The case had become a warning, a story mothers told their children, a scar on the town's trust in the institutions meant to protect its most vulnerable. Churches held vigils for Margaret long after her burial, candles flickering as neighbors prayed not just for her soul, but for an answer that would never come. Claire lived in that absence daily. The lawsuits dragged on. Money promised, but never touching the wound that mattered. Settlements might pay bills, but they could not silence the echo of her mother's final hours. She visited Margaret's grave often, kneeling in the grass, her fingers brushing over the carved letters. "I'm sorry," she whispered once, tears catching in her throat. "I should have found you sooner. I should have known." Her reckoning had become her legacy too. Friends described her as changed, more distant, more brittle. Smiles no longer reached her eyes. Her own daughter admitted, quietly, "I lost my mom too, the day my grandmother disappeared." Detectives Briggs and Ramos carried the case like an unfinished sentence. Briggs especially found himself returning to Rosewood in his mind, the elevator shaft lodged in his thoughts like a splinter. He would wake at night, the image of Margaret's twisted frame and the shaft replaying in brutal clarity. "She was so close," he told Ramos once, his voice low. "So damn close. And we all walked right past her." The official record closed with ambiguity. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death, undetermined. The words were bureaucratic, cold, a way to file away what could never truly be explained. But for those who had lived it, the truth was clear. Rosewood had failed. Whether through negligence, fear, or something darker, Margaret had been left to die in silence. The building itself began to wither under the weight of its infamy. Families pulled their loved ones out, the empty rooms multiplying until the West Wing sat dark and unused. Funding dried up, lawsuits drained resources, and whispers of permanent closure grew louder. But the whispers of Margaret were louder still. Maintenance staff reported strange occurrences during their rounds. Doors found ajar that had been locked hours earlier, call lights flashing in empty rooms, the faint sound of knocking in the service wing with no one inside. "It's just an old building," one orderly said nervously, forcing a laugh. "Old buildings make noises." But when he was alone, he admitted he never lingered near the shaft. For Claire, the legacy was not only fear, but determination. She began speaking publicly about elder care reform, standing in front of microphones with shaking hands, but a steady voice. "My mother's death was not just my tragedy, it was a failure of the system meant to protect her." Her words resonated, picked up by advocacy groups, fueling debates in state houses. Margaret's story became more than a mystery, it became a catalyst. Yet for all the public speeches and promises of reform, the personal wound remained raw. On quiet nights, Claire sat by her window, staring at the streetlights flickering in the distance. Sometimes she thought she heard her mother's voice, soft and trembling, calling her name. She knew it was only memory, only grief shaping sound into echoes. But she listened anyway. Because in the end, Margaret's legacy was not just the silence of Rosewood, or the reforms it inspired, it was the haunting truth that a woman could disappear in plain sight, trapped just feet away. Her cries unheard. Even now, Those who passed the facility at night swore they saw lights flicker in the west wing windows, long since emptied of residents. They whispered that if you stood near the service shaft and listened closely, you could hear faint cries drifting upward, the sound of a woman who had vanished into the walls, and perhaps that was the final cruelty, that Margaret's story had never really ended. It lived on in whispers, in echoes, in the silence that followed her name. Some stories resolve neatly, tied off with clear answers and clean endings. Margaret Hale's was not one of them. Hers was a story of silence and shadows, of unanswered questions that gnawed at those left behind. Even after her body was found, after her family laid her to rest, the truth of what happened inside Rosewood remained sealed behind locked doors and unspoken words. At her graveside, on a cool autumn morning, Claire stood among a small circle of mourners. The grass was damp with dew, the air sharp with the smell of fallen leaves. A simple headstone bore her mother's name, etched in gray stone. Claire's hand rested on the top of it, her thumb tracing the letters, as if by touch she could summon her mother's presence. "And I used to think finding you would bring me peace," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I was wrong. I found you, and all it gave me were more questions." Her daughter stood beside her, silent, holding her hand. For years she had watched her mother spiral into obsession, consumed by the search. Now she saw her mother hollowed by the answer, a woman rebuilt from grief, but never whole. Detective Briggs attended the burial too, though he stayed in the background. He had told himself it was for closure. But as he watched Claire, he realized closure was impossible. Some cases stayed with you forever, carving scars deeper than time could heal. After the ceremony, Claire lingered alone. She looked up at the sky, pale and cloud-streaked, and thought of all the nights she had driven in circles, calling her mother's name into the dark. She wondered if Margaret had heard, if those faint cries from the shaft had ever brushed the edge of her fading mind. The thought gutted her. In his office later, Briggs reopened the file one last time. The photographs were familiar now, the shaft, the clothing, the brittle bones laid out under forensic lights. He read through the notes again. Fractures inconsistent with a fall, slippers clean of mud, a door sealed from the outside. Each clue pointed toward human hands. Yet no suspect emerged, no confession surfaced. He wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page: "She did not disappear, she was hidden." It was as close to truth as he would ever come. For the community, Margaret's story became